Brad Olsen is an acclaimed author, book publisher, event producer whose captivating keynote presentations and interviews have left audiences spellbound. Lloyd Pye used to carry with him an elongated skull. Remember that?
Oh, I sure do. Star Child.
Yep, absolutely. Now, what about these elongated skulls that I've seen all around different areas of Central America?
Yes, Central America, South America, here in North America as well, around the Black Sea region to China, even Southeast Asia. Now, these elongated skulls are very unique. I've seen them in a museum in the Sacred Valley of Peru. Their heads are 30% larger than a human's skull. If you try to bind a head or put a board on it or wrap it up, yeah, you can change the structure of a skull. But what you cannot do is add 30% cranial capacity and 30% larger brain size. So they're human-like, George, but they're not quite human. So, for example, they also have 30% larger eye sockets. They don't have the central crack, the suture in the front of the forehead, and their spinal cord comes up into the body, also 30% larger. So you do the math. 30% larger head, 30% larger body, more cranial capacity, meaning they could be smarter than humans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are they alien?
Well, that's what we were talking about earlier. Maybe they were the offspring of the Anunnaki, the Nephilim. And were they alien? Well, it seems so. We don't see them walking around too much in the world today, but maybe there are some that still exist.
Now, there are some that say the culture of that time forced them to elongate human skulls. I'm not sure about that. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't think the culture could do that either. I've seen the exhibits, and I've studied some of the tribal people, like the Nez Perce and the Flathead Indians of Idaho. Yeah, and they did cranial deformation. But again, you can't create 30% larger skull or brain matter.
There's a map called the Piri-Rees map, P-I-R-I-R-I-S.
Oh, yeah.
What makes it so unusual?
Well, what's so unusual is not only was it created only 20 years after Columbus made his first voyage, but it shows the perfect outline of South America as well as connecting down to Antarctica. But what makes the Piri-Rees map really fascinating is it shows Antarctica before the ice. And now they're doing sonar radar across the Larsen ice shelf, George, which is depicted on the Piri-Rees map without ice, and finding those islands on the map are under the ice. So it was clearly drawn probably from source maps. In fact, in the liner notes of the Piri-Rees map, it does say that the source maps came from the Library of Alexandria and Ptolemaic Greece. So way back in the classical era that these maps were handed down, and many of them preserved in the Library of Alexandria. And I would dare to say maybe some of them still exist in the Vatican Library.
And the map that shows these islands also could only have been seen from above, right?
Well, that's it. That's the other thing that's so peculiar about it. And it shows the correct proportion of Western Africa and Eastern South America, proportion meaning the size of the Atlantic Ocean in between. So that, too, would have best been surveyed from above.
All these things that are happening on the planet, Brad, why are we just beginning to find out what they are? Why is it taking so long?
Yeah, I think there was a concerted effort to disguise all this evidence. And, for example, with the giants, it just didn't go along with the narrative. And even though this evidence was being found, there's countless stories of the Smithsonian Institute coming into giant digs and confiscating the bones. And they say they just threw them in the Atlantic Ocean. Just get them out of here. They just didn't want to deal with it. So I think so much of our history has just been manipulated so we don't think that there was this high-tech civilization on the Earth, for example, or these giants that once roamed the Earth. Their bones have been found around the world. It's really hard to refute the evidence. And out here where I'm at in northwestern Nevada, just here with Tanya Middleford and Frank Jacob, we're filming some segments for a new documentary about the giants of Lake Lahontan, which was this giant freshwater lake that was here, and mummified giants were found in the caves.
Was Goliath a giant?
Goliath was a giant. By all intents and purposes, he was depicted as being about 3 or 4 times the size of a man. Of course, David, with his good aim and a slingshot, nailed him right between the eyes and took him down. But that begs the question, George, were these giants still alive in historic times, or even in the time of the Bible? And were they human that were just really, really tall and big, or were they a different species that are human-like but not quite human?
Were they the biblical Nephilim?
You have in the Old Testament of the Bible the men of renown who came down here to mate with earth women because they saw they were pretty, and they had these offspring called the Nephilim, who would have also been very, very tall. But what's interesting about that is that you have 2 different species that can mate. For example, a horse and a donkey are 2 different species, but they can mate, and their offspring is a mule. The mule, however, is sterile. It cannot have offspring of its own.
That's right.
So this could be the case with the Nephilim. Maybe they were just one-offs and were treated like royalty and gods, but they weren't able to sustain their population.
Megalithic structures are all around the planet. What generally are they?
Well, megalithic just means mega, large, lithic, made out of stone. That would be Stonehenge, from the Machu Picchu in Peru to many megalithic ruins in Göbekli
Tepe?
Yes, indeed. So it's anything with very large blocks that are usually joined together. The really, really big ones are called Cyclopean architecture, named after Cyclops in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And those ones really boggle the mind, how ancient people were able to move these massive stones. For example, Baalbek in Lebanon, those blocks are so big, you don't even have a crane in the world today that can move them.
Same with the pyramid blocks.
Correct. Yeah, and the internal structure of the pyramid as well is all megalithic, massive blocks, much bigger than the blocks they used to build the pyramid.
What's your best guess on how they moved them?
Well, one of the episodes of Ancient Aliens I was on, we were talking about auditive levitation, and that is using sound and frequency to render matter weightless or to make it, to destroy it. So, for example, an opera singer is able to shatter a wine glass with her voice, and that's in a form of auditive changing the matter. Perhaps they had some technology that we're still playing catch-up to try to understand. But you can look on YouTube, there are videos of levitation of bowling balls just floating in the air, moving around, even a frog that's flipping around. So it is possible. The technology is there. We're just trying to play catch-up and see how they move these massive blocks doing it.
Brad, Laos, which borders Vietnam, was subjected to bombings when we were out there bombing Vietnam. And apparently there are still hundreds of thousands of unexploded bombs all around Laos. Did the plane of jars get hit, do you know?
Oh, it sure did, George. It's a real tragedy. The first thing you notice when you walk out to the one of many sites in this area, there are dozens of locations where these jars are at, near a town called Phon Savin. The first thing you notice are these big craters that were the bombing craters of B-52 bombers, because the plain of jars in this town of Phon Savin was right on this major trade route that was the Ho Chi Minh Trail during the Vietnam War. And the U.S. just carpet bombed the area, and the UXOs, which are unexploded ordnances, are still vexing the population to this day. The statistic in one of the museums said that every 2 weeks, a Laotian farmer or a child just playing around and finds one of these unexploded ordnances will be killed or maimed. Every 2 weeks, George. And they're very poor people, but so friendly. I almost kind of felt guilty being an American, seeing all the carnage that got left behind. But it turns out they're pretty apologetic, and I was, and they're very forgiving for what Americans did. Of course, I was just a little child during the Vietnam War. I had nothing to do with it. But I do like to bring light to the fact that Laos is open for tourism. The people are great there. The food is really good, too, and it's very inexpensive to travel. Great place to go in the winter when it's really cold here in North America.
Have we found anything inside the jars?
Yes, they did find some bones and some funerary objects. But for the most part, they were empty because the plain of jars had been sacked many times by Chinese raiders who were fortune seekers just trying to loot and rape.
Anything valuable in there, you think?
Not anymore. It's been a long time since any funerary objects were laid intact. What has been found was buried underground, but the jars were used in combat during the First Indochina War, and that was against the French during the fight for independence in the 1950s. And soldiers were actually positioned in the jars, so you could still see some bullet holes on the jars, and several of them had been hit directly with the American bombs and were scattered everywhere.
What are they made out of, Brad?
Oh, well, they're made out of several different kind of stones, but some of them are really strong, made out of granite, others sandstone, and other composite stones. So they have stood up to the test of time. As you said in the setup piece, they're 2,500 to 1,500 years old, and they have endured wars and raiding parties and destruction, yet they're still there, and it's one of the great enigmas of Southeast Asia of what they were exactly used for.
I saw a picture of a family sitting inside one of the jars, and this jar was so big, Brad, you could barely see the three people who were sitting inside of it.
And you know me, George, I'm a really tall guy, and I'm standing there with my arm on some of these jars, and they're partly buried in the ground. They're 2 meters tall. The biggest one is 3 meters tall. I was reaching up there like I'm trying to touch the rim of a basketball net.
Eric Rankin with us, researcher, author, speaker, groundbreaking discovery connecting fundamental geometry with specific musical harmonics that has resulted in him being invited to a number of think tanks by some of the world's top physicists. His findings have been called by many to be the proof that we've been looking for, that humanity has indeed been receiving information from some higher form of intelligence for thousands of years.
People are just now top-level researchers like Graham Hancock and Robert Edward Grant. They're finding that there's so much information embedded about our planet, about these ancient structures, the Great Pyramid of Giza. So we can not deny that some form of intelligence, and we can trace this back to a moment in time. And that moment is what I would call the great intervention of all ancient alien stories. It's 6,000 years ago in Samaria. What we have around the world pre-6,000 years ago is pretty much a hunter-gatherer existence for almost all of humanity. What led me to the ancient alien theory was a particular thing. So while the world was primarily hunter-gatherer, in one place, in Samaria, 6,000 years ago, one group of people, a very small group of people, they said they were visited by these extraterrestrials who gave them information and technology that had not existed before, the wheeled and axled vehicle, the world's first written language, a math system based on 12s and 60s, the first plow, the first arch, the first loomed weave fabric, the first pottery wheel, and the first pyramid structure. All of these inventions that we wonder, how the heck could these people at one time come up with all this technology? And we can read their text. It's a language cuneiform that we can read, and there's 10,000 of these clay cuneiform tablets in UCLA library, and they tell of these sky beings that they called the Anunnaki, and the Anunnaki means from the sky. These visitors came, or kin of ours came from the sky. There's different interpretations, but one thing's for sure is these people came from the sky and shared this information with us. And we can look at that and just go, well, that's ridiculous. But when we start plugging in the technology that we use and realize and making measurements of our local solar system, the moon, the sun, the earth, we realize that these numbers are embedded in that as well. So it's all of a sudden becomes an information schematic that we couldn't solve until we had the technology, like recent technology, to understand what these number sequences, the significance of what these number sequences are.
How did physicists get interested in your work with tunes and frequencies?
It really happened in earnest when I met a man named Robert Grant, and he has become a top-level researcher, written many books. He's very popular on the speaking circuit. He was the first person to invite me into sort of a think tank environment with other really high-level people, inventors, other physicists. He's not technically a physicist, mathematicians. And I met one there who's the dean of physics, Minas Kafados. He's a Greek top-level physicist, dean at Chapman University. And I had built these models that used a lot of the information that I got, taking the flower of life pattern, if people are familiar with that, and making it a multidimensional model. And he walked around my apartment and said, first thing he said, where did you get your physics degree? And I said, well, I've never attended a physics class in my life. He said, well, how did you build these models? And I said, well, I took this bit of information and combined it with this bit of information, used the flower of life as a template. And he goes, this is the most elegant expression of the quantum universe I've ever seen. And at that moment, I realized that I'm not just thinking stuff up in my head, that there's really something going on here.
You bonder on being a genius. You know that, Eric.
People can ramble on about stuff like this and sound either crazy or you wonder if they might have something going on. But fortunately, there is tons of new data that backs all this information up that says, I could give you an example. So take the number 432. We were taught a timekeeping system back 6,000 years ago to divide our day and night into 12 different segments and multiply those by 60 seconds and then 60 minutes. But humanity did not have a way to tick off those seconds mechanically or measure them until about 150 years ago. But that formula gave us 43,200 seconds of day and 43,200 seconds of night. And incredibly, where I heard this first, Graham Hancock, he didn't discover this, but he shared it. If you take the Great Pyramid of Giza and measure out the base of it, draw that base measurement into a straight line and multiply it by 43,200, the same number of seconds in day or night, you get the equatorial circumference of planet Earth. And if you measure the height of the pyramid from the ground to the apex and multiply it times 43,200, you get the dead center of the Earth to the tip of the North Pole. Humanity could not have known any of this information, yet there it was. They were writing it, they were using it to some degree, but they could not have known what it was going to someday reveal. But it's like timed release. As humanity evolves, and if they evolve, and if they develop certain technologies, we will come to realize that someone has been communicating to us through number patterns since at least 6,000 years ago. That's when we started writing. So anything before that's kind of conjecture. But we can go back to this moment when the Anunnaki are said to have visited and shared these sudden technologies with us. And at that same moment, that's when we've got this arrival of this extraterrestrial story. That's the moment we launch all these technologies. So it's truly an incredible discovery that many people are actually tapping into now. There's lots of people getting bits and pieces of this puzzle, and I just keep adding them in because they fit perfectly with each other. There's no fudging or, isn't it amazing how close this is? It's like gears on a Swiss watch, these numbers, these patterns, the mechanical movements of the Earth. All of these measurements fit absolutely without any tolerance. They fit perfectly with each other. So it's not guesstimates, it's not mythology, it's not lore, it's not religion. It is revealing things about our planet, our sun, our moon, our local solar system that could not have been known at the time, but because we got to a place where we could make measurements of the sun So in music, we have what's called octaves, and that's the same note, either twice as high or half as low. So if you sing do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, both do's are the same note, an octave apart, meaning they're doubled. It's double the frequency. If you take 432 and double the frequency, you get 864. Well, the sun, measured in miles, is 864,000,000 across in miles. It does not just happen. If you go half from 432, you get 216, same tone, half lower. Go half of that, 108, same tone, but lower, all related to the same tone of 432. The sun is 108 sun widths away from us. From planet Earth to the sun is 108 sun widths, and the moon is 108 moon widths from Earth.
Now, what's the significance, Eric?
I would say that the significance, as crazy as it sounds, is that we are living in not only an engineered reality here on Earth, but quite possibly an engineered local reality around us.
Is there a method and a message behind this?
Well, the method we could only guess at right now. I mean, you can go anything from game theory, which is this is all just a hologram supported by a geometric matrix holding information, and we're all just players in it, either like the Sims game, there's someone above us, like some people call our overself, like our soul body, that is maneuvering our earthbound little humanoid biological body around like a video game. Or there's been genetic experimentation going on both in biological entities and as big as planet Earth, as big as the sun, as big as the moon. There's too much perfection in engineering showing up. I mean, we have to scratch our heads and go, how is this possible, even an eclipse?
Eric, do you think Steven Spielberg, the director of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, was on to something when he kept doing those tones? Bum, 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 bum.
Yeah, I actually do. And, you know, you might not know that George Van Tassel was interviewed by Steven Spielberg before Close Encounters came out. And he was invited to the premiere in Las Vegas and Los Angeles. So I wonder if there could be a connection that the seed was planted of frequency being used as a medium to open up a channel of communication between us and whoever else might be listening or might be waiting for us to prove that we've gotten certain aspects of mathematics and music down. And we're getting very close to that. The Fibonacci spiral that's found in nature, that has a musical tonality to it. The pineal spin, like pine cones and pineapples, that has a mathematical musical aspect to it. So if we were to play those tones in order that those geometric shapes are revealing to us and broadcast them out into the universe, and they're heard by someone like, whoa, they've made the connection here. So I think that that's very possible that Steven Spielberg thought that that was a viable way of making first contact and kind of bridging between us and an extraterrestrial species.
Tell us a little bit about As Above, So Below, the quantum teachings of Jesus. How did you get interested in that?
Yeah, well, I grew up with a Christian background, as many people do, and it made perfect sense to me as I was growing up. And then I got into my late teen years, and I realized there was a lot of other religions out there that I really didn't know anything about. And as I became curious, I thought, well, in many ways don't sound any more strange than mine, and in some ways seem to make more sense. And I kind of faltered in my Christianity, especially the part of any religion that says we've got it figured out and everybody else doesn't, and probably going to hell for eternity didn't really set that well with me. So I started a project a long time ago, taking the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, and reinterpreting it through a lens, because I've learned so much in the last 15 years about physics and the elementary physical aspects of the way our world works. And in many of Jesus' teachings, it seems like he was kind of aware of those processes. He was getting his disciples ready to go out, sending them out to preach in his name. And they said, how are we going to tell people that you really understand what God is and how he works, and why should people believe you? And Jesus said cryptically, tell people I am motion and rest. And you could not describe in 2 words the energy of pulse. When you have pulse, then you have vibration, and if you have vibration, you have frequency, and if you have pulse, you have energy. So Tesla said if you want to understand the universe, you think of energy, vibration, frequency, and here's Jesus talking about it 2,000 years ago. So it's not a religious book. It's written very softly to honor any spiritual seekers. I don't even use the word religion in the book. Spiritual seekers, and just kind of take the fundamental teachings of Jesus and run them through different, more elementary physics ideas and theories. And ultimately comes about application. What were the teachings of Jesus that weren't super mystical, weren't him saying, I am God and nobody gets to heaven except through me? Those are very rare quote quotes. 99% of Jesus' teachings, in any form that we can read them, were calls to action. Be kind, be considerate, be forgiving, be like I am being. I kind of wonder if that quote, I am the light and the truth of the world, and as I am, only through me, and I'm really thinking like only through the way that I am, the way that I'm showing you how to be is the way that you get to heaven, and heaven can start right here on earth. He was really telling people heaven is already inside of you, and the way you unlock that, the way you enter that kingdom is being a kind, considerate human being. And very elemental teachings that if the world followed them, it'd be a different world.
Now, wasn't George Van Tassel into Jesus, too, in a big way?
He actually was. A lot of people think George Van Tassel must have been, some crazy guy just talking to aliens. But the more he learned, and the more he learned about things that we call miracles, and you could date this back, is when somebody did not understand how something worked, it was called a miracle. And then we start getting into the sciences, and we understand Newtonian laws and push and pull and forces, and we start going, oh, that wasn't a miracle. We understand how that works now. I believe that many of Jesus' teachings were things that we just don't understand how they were done yet. And George Van Tassel actually believed that Jesus might have been an extraterrestrial visitor. That became his final thought on the matter, because he never renounced Jesus. He was a suit and tie, church-going Christian till the day he died in 1978, the year that I graduated high school. The application of it, when you think of it through his lens, that maybe Jesus was just almost like a new proto-human, like that technology is actually already inside of us. We think that we're 90% junk DNA. Well, nature doesn't fill itself with a bunch of junk things that it doesn't need. I would say very probably inactive things that are built inside of us. And once they're turned on, switched on in our coding, in our DNA, and in our genetics, we will be able to do things that look like miracles 10 years ago. And I think that that's really what Jesus was alluding to, is we are of the Father. You go back to Genesis, Paul, you don't hear a singular God, you hear the plural gods saying, let's make them in our image, meaning we have the technology, those beings have the technology to somehow be involved in our creation. And I believe that they were trying to share, this kind of bridges both the ancient alien and the Jesus stories, that the quote-unquote gods were trying to share information with us that would make us a more intelligent, enlightened species.
Who were the gods, Eric?
We go back to the Anunnaki. I mean, you could call them many different terms in many different religions, but I always go back to the Anunnaki because in the ancient alien theory canon, we have what are called interventions. It's not just seeing a light in the sky. It's not just shaking hands with an alien or going aboard a ship and being probed and sent back down. It is an actual conversation of sorts. It is an intervention. And 6,000 years ago is the best example that I still believe is out there of a intervention that changed the course of history for humanity, was when these sky visitors came down and shared all this information of how to jumpstart our technological advancement. And we're still using those devices today. They're just higher tech versions of the same things that they were taught 6,000 years ago.